Hello, I am Thomas or T.L. Mogford, and I'm the author of The Plant Hunter. What is my book about? The Plant Hunter is set in the Victorian period at a time when exotic plants were extremely valuable to wealthy Victorian collectors, and it tells the story of Harry Compton, who is bequeathed a map which shows the location of a very rare, very valuable ornamental tree growing in the interior of China, and he embarks on a journey to find it, pursued by some fairly nefarious characters. 3 words to describe my book: horticultural Indiana Jones. What does my writing routine look like? I try to do 1,000 words a day, because a friend once pointed out that if you do 1,000 words a day, within 70 days you could have a complete novel. So that always gives me hope, but it's probably not every day that that's done. We've got 2 primary school age children, so the routine tends to kick in during the school term, and then weekends I seem to be driving them around South London to various football matches. The holidays seem to get swallowed up. So yes, I would say 1,000 words a day during the term time. It's probably as close to a routine as I've got. Other than writer, what's my dream job? A dream job I still toy with is I once worked as a security guard in a museum in Venice. It was a small museum, and I just went round room by room, ostensibly waiting for some crime to occur, which it never did, but in reality staring at the paintings. And I sometimes imagine what it would be like to have that job in the National Gallery, because I think you'd never tire of what you could look at, and just moving room to room. And that's of course assuming that no security work was actually required, which perhaps it might be more likely that it were in London, but that would be a great job, I think, someday. But when I was young, I was really into the David Attenborough's Zoo Quest series of books, actually, but I long to be a wildlife documentary maker. In real life, what's my kind of adventure? Before we had kids, my wife and I were getting quite into hopping on easy jets and Ryanair flights and zipping off to slightly lesser known cities of Europe. And we started with Berlin, which was obviously not that unknown, but then we went to Sofia in Bulgaria, and then Saranda in Albania, and we were really getting into the thrill of touching down somewhere unknown and having a long weekend just to throw yourself into it. So they were really the ideal adventures, which have slightly been paused over the last 9 or so years. But I think we might get back into those if flying is still permissible. But I really adored that sense of discovery, and particularly in a city that was not necessarily chock full of tourists. The best thing about being a writer, sort of intensity of living a different life. When you're reading a book, you, I think, have that experience, or watching a film or a TV drama. But for me, writing a book is a level even beyond that, and it is almost like having a parallel existence, which is a really thrilling thing to be able to do, and to enhance normal everyday life. So that's the ultimate for me. The hardest thing about being a writer, the hardest thing I think is waiting for responses to what you've written. I've read somewhere that Martin Amis had written in his an old-fashioned passport occupation writer, and he was sort of doodling, and he found himself changing the R of writer to an A, because he felt that part of the job was simply waiting. And I find that I'm quite impatient, as I think probably most people are deep down, and sometimes sending something off and not getting any response at all is a strange sort of torture, because you think, when will it come? Will it ever come? You know, should I prompt? Should I probe? And was it better to stay? And you sort of tear yourself into knots. So I think the waiting for other people's responses, which is, you know, an important part of the job. And I think the best way to overcome it is just to crack on with the next project. 3 books and authors who have influenced me. It's difficult to narrow it down, but I would go for as a first one, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, because I think that the device of a protagonist receiving a mysterious map I find really irresistible, and I also enjoyed that being used in The Beach by Alex Garland as a kind of 90s adventure novel. So that would be my first. Second, I'd go for My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier, partly because she's setting it in sort of mid to late Victorian period, and her style remains very, very clear and sort of clean and crisp, and that was a bit of an inspiration of how to approach The Plant Hunter stylistically. But also she has a fascinating, you know, flawed female character at the center of the novel, which I tried to be inspired by as well in Clarissa Lockhart within The Plant Hunter. So she would be my number 2, and as a third, I'd go for Any Human Heart by William Boyd, because I think there's a kind of generosity of spirit to all William Boyd's novels, which both for the reader, but also as a kind of sensibility of seeing the world and the people in it for all their flaws and foibles as being something rather rich and mysterious and wonderful. And I try to take inspiration from that. What's the best advice someone's ever given me about writing? Strangely, it was probably from my 8-year-old son. I'd written a previous version of The Plant Hunter, which it didn't quite work, and he'd asked me why, and I said, I think possibly some people find parts of it a bit boring, and he said, well, why don't you get rid of the boring parts? And it seemed such an obvious answer, but I never really thought of it. So after that I try to eliminate the boring parts, or at least if there's exposition, to contain it within something exciting, and at least be generous to the reader or potential reader, and make sure they're entertained as they go.